So with Formula E, when the concept was first being mooted back in 2012, I don't know if you know the story of the napkin in the Paris restaurant.
I'm not familiar with that now.
So Jean Todt was head of he was president of the FIA at the time, and he was having dinner in Paris with Alejandro Agag. Was he the original CEO and promoter of Formula E? And he was saying, oh, I've got this, I want to do this electric racing series. And Agag said, great, I'll help you do it. And they wrote down the concepts that they wanted for the series on the back of a napkin, basically.
Oh,
And I'm pretty sure that napkin's like framed somewhere in the Formula E office. But one of the original concepts is that the E doesn't just stand for electric; it stands for entertainment as well.
yeah.
And what was the third one? Probably efficient or something like that. Anyway, doesn't matter. The important thing was that the E was also supposed to stand for entertainment. And you can see where Formula E has tried to buck the traditional trends. I mean, fan boost in the first few seasons, widely disliked concept in the end, and that actually had very, very little difference in terms of actually affecting the race order. I think I can remember one time where activating fan boost actually led to any kind of overtake. Um, but at the end of the day, it was all about engaging the fans, which it did do. Even if most of the people voting were Chinese bots. Um, and then you think about um, the race day format as well, which is obviously a single day. So when you buy a ticket, you're going to a 1 day event, unlike Grand Prix, for example, where you would pay 3 times as much money and only see some practice sessions just to get a Friday ticket, right?
Yeah.
And also the important thing that they were doing is that because they were doing it directly in city centres initially, anyway, they've started bucking their own trend in that regard with the new venues. But going straight into the city centres and taking the racing to the people rather than people driving out to the arse end of nowhere, which is where most racetracks are. So it was incredibly accessible, which was obviously the important thing, and it needed to be because A, it was a brand new racing series that no one had ever heard of, and B, the point of Formula E was to develop EV technology, but also change the perception of EVs. Because EVs are considered very boring and the batteries only last 10 minutes and then they take 7 hours to charge up again. And some of that is still true. But um, yeah, so the exciting element there um, is seeing these cars racing across, these really cool landmarks and on city streets and also consider the most fundamental part of what Formula E which is about, which is that it is in terms of car development, it is purely about the powertrain. So everybody using the same chassis, the same tires, the same battery, even as well. All the manufacturers have to focus on is how they're getting that power from the battery to the rear wheels and the front wheels now at times as well with the new car. And then the software element involved in that as well, which is not fun to talk about, but it is by far and away after once you've made your powertrain and you've got that homologated for 2 years, software is the most important thing. Software is the equivalent of aero updates in Formula One. So and with even with that as well, they're extremely limited because the power is limited, for example, and the regen is limited. So what you end up with is an incredibly competitive formula where for the majority of seasons, 80% of the grid are capable of winning races.
Yeah.
And it's nice going into a weekend not knowing who's going to win, right?
Yeah, it's
I
more
know
insane. 100%.
this year well, it was supposed to be this year that we were going to have 4 teams fighting for everyone. It's kind of not turning out to be the case, but particularly the second half of last year in Formula One, where we had 4 teams fighting for wins and you wouldn't know who was going to win. That was a rarity. That is such a
very rare.
that is such a exception to the rule, because the far more common element is for either one team to dominate or for there to be 2 clear teams. Even having 2 teams winning, regularly being able to fight for wins is quite rare these days. So having multiple teams being able to fight for that, for the wins and for the podiums, I think that's a lot of fun. And obviously Formula E's been refined a lot. They've got rid of some of the gimmicks like fan boost, like lottery draws for qualifying groups. They used to do that back in the day as well. And then even then the qualifying format still basically, because then they did it in championship order, which basically meant if you were leading the championship, you were going to start 18th if you were lucky. Whereas the format they've got now is really, really good with the dual stages. What I will say, and this is where Formula E kind of loses me a little bit, is that since Gen 3 came in, we've had a lot of what they call the peloton style races, where nobody wants to lead because it's not efficient enough. They all want to be hovering around 10th place, and they're all fighting to be in 10th place rather than leading for the first 90% of a race, and then the last 5 laps they actually start pushing. That, to me, is not entertaining. I know some people love it, and some drivers absolutely relish the whole, 4-dimensional chess element of that. Me as a viewer, not.
It's like you're only watching 5 good laps.
Exactly. Yeah, is that you may as well not even bother watching the first portion of the race, right? So I think there's still an issue there. But overall, Formula E does a very good job of putting on a show. And sorry, last point on this question. I know I've been talking for a while, but
it's all right, it's fine.
The thing at Formula E are also they'll admit they are the sort of chaos championship, and they sort of breed it to be that way as well. They like inducing a little bit of chaos, so that's why they'll introduce that, like, oh, this chicane's a bit iffy, wouldn't do this in other series, or what was one? There was some of the surfaces they race on are absolute garbage as well, and they try and inject as much chaos into it as they can, which is the entertainment as well.
Yeah. What would you say drew you to commentating in Formula E, and how did you first find it?
So, well, this is quite a long story. Obviously, my relationship with Formula E is very layered. I was, probably younger than you are when I first went into the paddock, because I just picked up my A levels. I started freelancing, and I was working for an Irish motorsport website that mainly did Formula One, but was dipping its toe into Formula E. And I thought, I can sort of take that over and keep pushing hard on that. So that was the start of season 2, which would have been 2015, and it was lucky that Formula E sort of came around the right time for me, because it was at a time they were just sort of letting anyone in because they needed media at these events. And by the time they started getting a little bit more selective about it, I'd already built up a reputation. as a good journalist for the series, and having good relations with the people in the championship as well. So that came about a really good time for me because I was learning a lot. I was on Autosport's young writer development program, which sadly no longer exists. And so I was taking the lessons there, applying them into the big paddocks in Formula E, and really just trying to sort of make a name for myself and try and impress a few people and get myself a proper job, basically. When I learned that there was no money and no jobs in motorsport journalism at the time, then that's when I moved into PR. And just sort of by accident ended up having a Formula E client with the agency I was working for as well, which was the Nissan Edams, as it was at the time, team. That's why I ended up working for them. And then after I left that job and I had started doing some commentaries, so I'm sort of skipping over the initial commentary stuff then, but I got an agent who was, you know, a specialist in motorsport stuff, and I'd only done one job for them at the time. So this would have been 2022. Signed with them like in April. Did my first job in probably June, which was the American Speed Fest at Brands Hatch. So they have the NASCAR European Series that goes and races there, and they have all the truck racing and then off the circuit there's all the monster trucks, and it's a big celebration of all big American racing at Brands Hatch. So that was the first job I did for them. And then I get an email one day saying like, oh, they're looking for a circuit commentator to do the London E-Prix. And naturally, as soon as that landed in my inbox, I come back and I say, well, I was a Formula E journalist for 4 years. I've worked with one of the teams, and I'm London based. So I figured, you know, I'd be quite well placed for this. Not expecting them to, you know, actually go for that. You know, for the organisers of the London E-Prix to actually go for that, because it would have been a bit like, well, who the fuck is this guy? But somehow they said yes. And I remember walking around there, and I've sat in the TV booth. They're sort of all like flat pack little rooms, because they have to take them around all over the world. And I remember just thinking, who the fuck's giving me the keys to this? This just makes no sense at all. So again, sort of came around at the right time, really. And that was great. Really, really enjoyed it. Sadly, they don't do circuit comms for that event anymore. They just pump the TV commentary through the speakers instead, which I can understand why. It saves money. But I always like the fact you've got someone directly engaging with the audience that are there as well, because we were referencing people we could see on the cameras in the crowd. We were reading out tweets and messages and things like that, getting the crowd to sort of cheer as well, because that was the weekend where Jake Dennis got pole position and really dominated the race as well. I think it was only like his second win in Formula E, and it was like listening to the crowd when Jake Dennis was on the lap that was going to get in pole position, and the reaction of the crowd when he got pole position as well. That was immense. Absolutely loved that, and I'd like to think that I had a helping hand in geeing up the crowd a little bit, and like root for the Brit, especially someone like Jake Dennis. He's just absolute wonderful human being. So yeah, that's basically the story of my Formula, my very short commentary career in Formula E specifically.
Right. How do you think Formula E has evolved, and where do you see it going in the future?
Oh my God, it's so different. It's so different. The first season, there's so many elements in which it has done in terms of the technology and the cars, but also the attitude and the manufacturer involvement. So if you think back to the very first season, the cars were, oh my God, what did they do? 120 miles an hour if you were lucky. They had was a complete spec series. So this was before powertrain development, the first season. And they were disgustingly inefficient. You think now it took them maybe 3-4 years for everyone to decide we don't need multiple gears in these cars because we can set them up to just have one gear because it's got really great torque from the electric motor. And we can still get the good top end speed out of that as well. So there was no need for any gears. But the first Formula E car had 5 gears. So because no one really knew what it was supposed to be like, and so they just kind of made a normal racing car but made it electric. And the drivers involved in it at the time as well were questionable to say the least. So I'll tackle technology first. Technology wise, yes, huge leaps and bounds, because you think about that was 120 mile an hour car. The cars these days are theoretically capable of 180 miles an hour or 184 miles an hour, 300 kilometers an hour. They've never actually done this because the circuits are never big enough to allow them to do so. But yeah, you think about the speed of the car, the efficiency, the technology that has evolved in it as well. Like doing what was the first regen? Maybe 80 kilowatts or something. I don't quote me on that. But now we're talking, 600 kilowatts of regen, and that also is kind of reflected in where they want to take Formula E next, is to make it a bit more of a racing car, because right now Formula E is and has been from the beginning very low downforce, like the wings are just for show, street tires effectively, so like no grip in these cars at all, but you're dealing with an awful lot of power under your right foot. Which also means that when it rains, so I don't in London E-Prix probably last year, or maybe the year before, can't remember which one, it absolutely pissed it down in. But you've got drivers unable to go full throttle on the straights because there's too much power. They'll spin up the wheels. By the time they do get to full power, the next corners come up. So there's a huge imbalance between the power and the grip of the car. All the noise now about Gen 4 is about making it more of a racing car. The biggest change is going to be going on to semi-slick tires. So like much more of a racing tire, not the full-on slicks, but a track tire. That is going to gain them in just that one change so many seconds per lap. So so they want to make it a bit more of a racing car, and I guess pursue the lap times a little bit more. The other element as well with I guess with the circuits as well. So we touched on this in the first question, which is that it was all about city centers initially. Now the cars are getting much faster, that a lot of the venues that they had previously enjoyed are now not viable anymore. So there was the probably the biggest example of this was what happened in Rome, right? Because they went there the first year of Gen 3 with the same track they had previously been racing on, and there was just an almighty, huge, scary shunt with multiple cars involved over a blind bit of the circuit. And they immediately decided, we can't ever come back here. So that's when they started going to Misano instead, a proper, world-class permanent motor racing facility that hosts MotoGP, and Continental GT racing. And there's more of that coming as well. So Mexico City, obviously that's been on the calendar for a few years now. Obviously it's a different layout, but it's still the same facility. Jeddah, that's now on the circuit as well. The Grand Prix circuit, again, different layout. Um, the Homestead Speedway in Miami, permanent racing facility on an oval as well. What else is there? But you can just see there is an increase in the number of permanent facilities. And part of that is down to just what Formula E needs to have now compared to what it needed back in the day. And part of that as well is the recharging in the race. Because I think you'll notice as well that they're only doing it in the venues big enough to like with a pit lane big enough to accommodate having people working in the lane, basically. So they're doing it at Jeddah, Formula One venue, Monaco, Formula One venue. What are the other double headers as well, which are big enough to accommodate that. And then the other way in which it has changed is I guess the professionalism of the teams and the drivers. So as I said, the season one drivers very questionable. And even for the first few years, we had some real questionable drivers in there. When Formula E first started, you had to be part of specific drivers clubs in order to actually get a seat. And because they wanted to ensure a certain level of professionalism. And sure, if you looked on the surface, there was some good people in there, but there were some real duds. And that continued for a while. But after a few years, it became fully professional and one of the very few racing series, and we're talking one of 2 or 3 in the world, where all the drivers are paid to race, not paying to race. We're talking Formula One and Formula E. That's it. Maybe IndyCar. You could argue IndyCar, but even then there are quite a few drivers paying for those seats, especially at the back. So, and the attitudes of the teams and the manufacturers involved as well. Like the first season, it was open season with the fact like, yeah, sure, come in, go and look at the car, no, yeah, do whatever you want. Yeah, you can. Oh, you want to go and get the driver? You want to take a photo? You can go and do the thing, and you could just waltz into garages, no problem. And then, sure enough, a couple of years go by, barriers start coming up in front of the garages. It's no come in unless you've been invited to. You couldn't just sort of grab people. For me as a journalist, you can just sort of like stop and have a conversation. All the drivers, they hide themselves away in the garages and in their own little rooms as well. And then obviously there was the manufacturer involvement as well, because before it was small teams. Basically, you had Renault, that was it. And then suddenly after that, you start getting Porsche, you start getting BMW, you start getting Audi, you get Nissan, you get I forget who else. Like there, so many came and gone about that. Jaguar as well, obviously. Was it the Stellantis brand was was already in there with DS, but then they sort of expanded that involvement as well with Maserati. So yeah, it's definitely changed a lot to answer your question.
What's the process for preparing for a Formula E race? How do you stay updated with all the teams and drivers?
So for me, specifically on Formula E, because my involvement now with Formula E is just doing a podcast now about it. I've become much more relaxed on knowing absolutely everything about Formula E. When I was a journalist, that was a different story. Obviously, the drivers would remain quite static. Obviously, we did have a few like mid-season changes, but you end up, when you go to about half the races, through the European part of the season, you end up seeing these guys every sort of 3 or 4 weeks. And so you'll have the sort of casual chat ups. You usually remain in contact with like the PRs in between races as well, because you'll try and organize stuff in advance as well. And you'll have sort of casual chats as well, because it's important to maintain those relationships on a not just a professional level, but also sort of semi-personal one as well. Like, don't just talk about work. Oh, how was your weekend? Oh, you saw you went on that holiday. And like, oh, well, when's the baby due? And doing with that with the drivers as well is very important, I think, because then they open up to you as well. So having good relations with the drivers is definitely important, because so the example that springs to mind, there was, I don't know if you were watching Formula E in like 2017. But so the championship battle, Lucas di Grassi, Sebastian Buemi, and everyone was waiting to hear news on whether Sebastian was going to miss 2 races in New York. It was the first ever New York race back then. Was he going to miss New York because of his contract with Toyota in the World Endurance Championship, which supposedly had priority? There was a race that weekend at Nürburgring. And so we're all waiting for news. How, is Seb going to miss these 2 races? He's fighting for the championship. That has a huge implication on it. And so shortly before we got that confirmation, I asked Lucas, and I had a good relationship with Lucas. I think we had a lot of respect for one another. And I asked Lucas, well, so you don't ask the difficult questions straight away, right? You butter them up a little bit first. You have to go in with the easy questions, and I think I even like stroked his ego a little bit. Oh, why is it always you and Seb who are going for, it's the 3rd year in a row where it's been you 2 fighting for the championship, and blah blah blah. And he was in a good mood, and then I immediately ruined it by asking him, obviously, if Seb misses these 2 races and that results in you winning the championship, how are you going to feel about that? Is it going to have less value to you? And immediately you see him, like, the mood drops. But he gave me an answer. Like, we had a good enough relationship where he gave me a good answer, and afterwards said, look, that I have a job to do, and I know you have a job to do, and spoke about it. I'm always good afterwards. Doesn't affect the relationship. He knows I've got to ask a shitty question every now and again. I think just trying to have good relationships with the teams and drivers, that isn't just always about racing, is a good way to sort of keep up with them.
Yeah, understand that. What's the most challenging aspects of commentating for Formula E, and how do you find it now with the change to going to podcasting?
Yeah, so when I did the 2 races in London, there's a lot going on in a Formula E race, even a relatively quiet Formula E race. And this was before Peloton style races where they're all trying to be 15th, right? This was before that even, because you've got a huge train of cars that are all trying to overtake, and then suddenly you get the attack modes coming in, right? And so you're trying to make a point about something and trying to explain something as well, because you got to assume that 90% of the people who've come to this event don't know what Formula E is, probably don't even know what racing is, as well, because a lot of Formula E fans are people who didn't watch racing before. So you're trying to explain fundamentals of racing to the audience. You're also trying to explain the niche elements of Formula E to them as well, like what the fuck is attack mode. And you'll be in the middle of trying to make this point when someone goes for that attack mode, and then, they've come out ahead of that person who took attack mode a lap before, or then this overtake's coming in, and you get interrupted by the action so much. And it's not even like huge big moments, it's just kind of stuff you have to acknowledge. So trying to get a coherent point across was actually quite challenging, I thought. And I said to Jack Nichols, was the commentator at the time, and I said to him, like boy, that's there's so much going on. He's like, and that was a quiet one. I go, I know. What it like tomorrow, if it's like really, really insane, what am I going to do then? So and I was learning like so much just about like commentary in general at that point as well. With the podcast, it's actually much easier because we're doing everything after the fact, right? The job of the podcast then is to explain how things happen, and I'm not being interrupted by the racing action, right? So was it that? How did this guy who was leading for most of the race suddenly end up 7th? And then that's the job of the podcast is to explain all those things and basically to give an opinion. Like obviously we did the Jeddah pre-1, and the first topic of conversation was what did we think of pit boost and recharging, which took up quite a bit of the show. So and it's nice to have that moment to sort of gather your thoughts as well. It's much more coherent. It's much easier to do for sure as well. And I have to say the whole, your point being interrupted by action is much less of a problem in other series I've commentated on, like GT racing, especially because you kind of get more warning actually because formally stuff tends to happen like really like that with no warning, whereas in other racing series I'm not going to start a long convoluted point when the leaders are absolutely nose to tail going into the best overtaking spot of the track, right? So it's much easier to kind of pace, to pick the moments and know when I've got to be focusing on the action or when can I spend a bit of time explaining something to the audience.